Welcome to the Study God Answers video for the sixth video in this 10-part Bible study on the book of Genesis. Abraham yet again resorts to the same strategy and asserts that Sarah is his sister. How does God's approach to this situation differ from last time? This time God goes directly to Abimelech and tells him that he will die if he keeps Sarah as his wife, and that basically he shouldn't touch him. With Pharaoh, he didn't go directly to Pharaoh. He just gave him some plagues, and then Pharaoh somehow figured out what was going on. So by going directly to Abimelech, that shows that Abimelech at least favored the one true God a little bit and had some sort of relationship with him. He probably had other gods that he favored, and maybe even ones that he favored more than the one true God, but he did have somewhat of a relationship because God could come to him in a dream. And then God afflicted Abimelech himself. It doesn't say what or how he afflicted him, and God didn't afflict the Pharaoh directly. So there's another difference. And then God also closed all the wombs of everyone within Abimelech's tribe, and that didn't happen with Pharaoh as well. What can we conclude about God's covenant with Abraham from the way God treated Abimelech? God closed the womb of all of Abimelech's tribe just so there wouldn't be any confusion. Now that Sarah was going to get pregnant soon, God didn't want there to be any confusion on who the father was. Was it Abimelech or Abraham? He needed Isaac to be from Abraham and Sarah. And so if people could be getting pregnant when they were with Abimelech, then Sarah gets pregnant shortly after. And everyone would have known that Sarah became, quote unquote, Abimelech's wife. Then there could have been confusion on who the father of Isaac was, and God didn't want that. What does prophet mean regarding Abraham, and why is it significant in this context? Prophet, not just for Abraham, but any prophet, was someone who was a spokesperson for God. And usually they came around like Isaiah and Jeremiah to kind of right the ship that was headed in the wrong direction, and as a warning to people that you should heed God's word or bad things will happen. And so in this context, God calls Abraham a prophet, mainly so that Abraham could intercede for Abimelech if Abimelech said he was sorry and repented for what had happened, just like would have happened with other prophets. And then Abimelech does, so then Abraham prays for Abimelech to God, and then God does accept the intercession of Abraham, and things go better for Abimelech after that. Abraham misled Abimelech because he thought the king's subjects were not God-fearing. Would a godless community be hostile towards your beliefs if they learned about them? Yes, and I would say that is even happening today. We live in a much more secular society, and if you look at Catholic theology and the teachings of the church and what is in the catechism, a lot of what is taught in there, especially along moral lines, go counter to what society is now teaching. And there is open hostility. If you go out and profess your beliefs to certain groups, you will get a lot of hostility. Have you concealed your beliefs for acceptance? Everyone has concealed their beliefs to get along, maybe. To be accepted within a group, I would say no, I haven't really concealed my beliefs. Now, that doesn't mean you go out and you tell everyone all your beliefs. Sometimes you don't do that, and you just don't say them, because what's the point? If I'm talking to a group of mechanics, they don't need to hear about my Catholic beliefs. It has no bearing on what we're doing. Or if I join a group and we like to go hiking, there's no real need to be talking a lot about that. It doesn't mean that can't come up and doesn't come up, but I don't think that you have to be always talking about your beliefs and how wrong you think everyone else is. If anything, I think you come off as judgmental if you do that. So I'd say concealing is a pretty strong word, and I haven't necessarily concealed my beliefs, but I also don't think one needs to go out there and always say all what your beliefs are. What does the name Isaac mean? Isaac means he laughed. And we see numerous examples between Abraham and Sarah of them laughing with just the mention of Isaac. What does the name Ishmael mean? Ishmael means God will hear. And that goes all the way back to the story of when Hagar ran away and God listened to her pleas. And that's where that name comes from. What explains God's preference of Isaac over Ishmael? God just wanted his covenant to go through Isaac and not through Ishmael. Ishmael was a human answer to Abraham's problem, and Isaac was a divine answer to Abraham and Sarah's problem. So God always knew what he wanted, which was for Sarah and Abraham to have a child and that his covenants would go through them. So when Abraham and Sarah came up with their own plan and then Ishmael came up, God was still like, nope, doesn't matter. That doesn't count. So he favored Isaac because that was who he wanted these covenantal promises to go through. What does it mean that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac? It could have just been roughhousing. Ishmael would have been 19 or so, while Isaac would have been like 6. And that would have probably been pretty traumatic to see that situation. But it also could have meant that Ishmael molested Isaac. Personally, I would say it was probably something more severe like that, but I don't know for sure. But it had to be something severe enough so that both Ishmael and Hagar get kicked out of their tribe. What do you think was the reason behind God's decision to save Hagar and Ishmael after Abraham cast them out? Quite simply, God promised Hagar that a great nation would come through Ishmael, and that hadn't happened yet. So God was going to protect and give divine protection to Ishmael. And if only Abraham had believed that, then he wouldn't have had to be deceiving the Pharaoh and King Abimelech, because God would have saved him just like he saved Hagar and Ishmael here. Why did God refer to Isaac as Abraham's only son? Probably because now that Ishmael was banished in a way from this tribe of Abraham's, he wouldn't have been considered family, even in just the ancient Near Eastern laws. So I'd say that's probably the reason. In the same way, when Jesus has a father in Joseph, yes, he was an adoptive son of Joseph, but he was still considered a son of Joseph. So it's kind of the same thing that happens here. Does it surprise you that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son? And what does this say about Abraham's trust in God? I would say yes, actually, it kind of does, in that we see other moments and times where Abraham's faith was wavering and he really wasn't trusting in God. All I can say is that most likely something happened in between those two incidences and this story that we see here. And we don't really know, the Bible doesn't say, but something was happening that Abraham ended up having the ultimate faith and trust in God. Would you be prepared to make the same sacrifice as Abraham and sacrifice your child if God requested it? First off, I think if anybody gets those thoughts in their head, that they probably should go get checked out. Nowadays, thankfully, because of what Jesus did, this would never happen. So if those thoughts come in your head, you probably should go get that checked out. But that being said, I think it would still be difficult because we don't have that close personal relationship that Abraham did with God, in that God manifested himself physically in forms to Abraham that he doesn't really do for us. So Abraham knew, because he talked enough, literally talked to God, that he knew this was actually God talking to him and asking him to do that. And maybe if that had happened to me and I was living back then and I had had the experience Abraham did, then yes, I would have probably gone through with it. But in today's day and age, I would say no. And plus, we don't have to anyway because of the ultimate sacrifice Jesus gave. Approximately how old do you think Isaac was when he was to be sacrificed? I like the idea that he was the same age as Jesus, as another prefiguration of Isaac to Christ. But regardless of his age, he definitely wasn't a child. He would have been a young man, strong enough to carry a bunch of wood. So he was at least a young adult. But I like to think that he was 33 or whatever age Jesus was when he died on the cross. Was Isaac aware that he was going to be a sacrifice to God? I think it's pretty obvious just reading through the text that he would have known. And that shows that he himself, Isaac, had a tremendous amount of faith in God. And he was about to be sacrificed. So, yes, Abraham was going to be the one to kill him, but Isaac was the one actually getting killed. And I think, like I said in the video, I think that often gets overlooked. We think of how hard it had to be for Abraham, but knowing that Isaac was an adult and he would have willingly put his hands out to get bound up and most likely would have had to climb up on the wood himself, I think that just shows what strong faith Isaac had. Isaac is another prefiguration of Christ. Can you think of ways their stories are similar? I pointed out 8 similarities in the video. I'm just going to highlight my favorites. One is I really like the age thing, and that is a little bit more speculation, but I think that's fitting. I also really like that Isaac carried the wood of his sacrifice up a mountain, and then Jesus carried the wood of his cross up a mountain. And then I also like the ram in the thickets, where if you think of the ram's head sticking out of the thickets, it would have had thorns and would have probably looked very similar to Jesus when he had a crown of thorns. And those are my favorite similarities between the two. How do they differ? One big difference is that this was a peaceful sacrifice for Isaac, and for Jesus it was much more violent. Jesus had many more violent things happen to him, and even being crucified is considered the worst form of death you possibly can have. I'm not saying being burned or being stabbed, however it would have been done, would have been great either, but being crucified is way worse. And then one can make an assumption that Isaac would have sinned in his life, and we know Jesus never sinned. The sacrifice narrative was a way to test Abraham. Has God ever put you to the test? If so, how? God puts everyone to various tests, and they can be small, they can be large, but I think we're tested all the time. A good example would be, maybe I don't feel like going to Mass this weekend, but I still go. In my mind, that's a test. Yes, it's a little test, but it's still a test. And have I been tested in bigger ways? Of course I have. But the point is that whether the test is small or large, that you come through it in the best way that you can, and that you always have that trust and faith that God has the best intentions for you, regardless of the outcome. How do you define obedience to God? Obedience to God is doing God's will, and that is not always the most obvious thing. Sometimes God gives you subtle clues and they can be easy to ignore. But I think the key to being obedient to God is listening to what God wants from you. And He will give you hints and clues, and then it's up to you to follow. Does this definition accurately describe you? Now I would say yes. In the past, no. There was a time in my life I didn't go to church. In fact, quite a long period of time, I never went into a church. And I just wasn't listening for God. I didn't have a relationship with God. Another way that you build that relationship with God is just praying, having a good prayer life, and just meditating and listening quietly. As Catholics, we have adoration, where the Eucharist, which as Catholics we believe that the Eucharist is really the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. And during adoration, that is there. So Jesus is with us in adoration. And going to adoration, you can just sit there, listen, look at God, and look for any cues or listen and see if God tells you anything. And those are ways to be obedient, just by listening and praying to God. And then you can find out, hopefully, what his path he has for you is. What was Abraham's reason for not wanting his son to marry a Canaanite woman? He didn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman because he wanted Isaac to stay pure and not end up getting swayed by a wife. We saw previously, before the flood, between the sons of God and the daughters of man marrying, and then bad things started happening. So Abraham would have known that history, and he just didn't want Isaac to falter in what God's plan was for him and his descendants. Would you be willing to marry someone your parents disapprove of? Thankfully, I didn't have that problem, but would I have married someone my parents disapproved of? It would really sort of depend on my parents. What kind of people were they? Were they quick to jump to conclusions about someone? Would they know this person as well as I did? But I would always heed their advice to a point, and I think if not only just parents, but if a lot of people are telling you, are you sure about this? Maybe you should take heed and listen to their advice and rethink about things. Abraham's servant seeks God's help to choose a wife for Isaac. What standards did people use in Abraham's time in choosing a spouse? One, we see that even though Abraham's servant wasn't only praying or believing in the one true God, he still prayed to the God of his master. So one thing is praying. I think a lot of people did that. More than anything, it seems like the standards revolved around family and tribe. So usually you would have someone of your children marry like a first cousin. That was always common. And then, of course, the whole dowry thing. I think it was important that, especially for girls, to marry someone who had some wealth to them so they would know that they would be taken care of. What standards do people today use for selecting a spouse? Probably some similar ones. I think most people want to have a secure life. So does their future spouse have a good job, make a good living? Do the parents approve? I do think a lot of people want or desire approval from their parents. But the main difference is that they get to decide for themselves. And I don't really know, at least in America, there's not too many instances where people aren't. anymore. Although there's other countries where there still is arranged marriages and they seem to work out. I'd also say in our society we deem love as being an important element before you get married, that you should love this person. Is God still active in helping people select spouses? I think that depends. Do you ask God? Do you pray about a future spouse? I think if you do that, I think God will help you. But if you close God off or you don't acknowledge God, just like back in those days, he won't help you. But you're not really looking for his help. And think about that with anyone you know. If you need help on something and you ask, you're more willing to accept that help. But let's say somebody just offers help and you don't need it, you're less inclined to take it. So I would say the same thing happens here. That if you ask God or want God's help, he will help you in choosing a spouse. But if you don't want it or don't ask for it, no, he won't. What led Rebekah to cover herself with a veil after she was told that Isaac was there? Mainly out of respect. And in the cultures of that time, that's what women would do. They would really only show their eyes. And we see that still in certain Muslim communities where the women will do that. But just like in the time with Rebecca when she had to put her veil on after Isaac showed up, the same thing happens with Muslim families here. A lot of times in their house they won't be veiled, but it's only when they go out that they veil. But it's mainly just done out of a show of respect. And maybe a little bit out of modesty, but I don't think that was as important as the respect element. It wasn't until after their marriage that Isaac grew to love Rebekah. Is loving your future spouse before marriage necessary? Necessary is a pretty strong word. I would say it's good to have love, and I think in almost all marriages nowadays there is love before, but part of it is let's define love, and we'll be doing that in the next question, so I'll save it for then. But is it absolutely necessary? I'd say no, because if the two people getting married work together, they will grow to love each other. And I would say even if you love your spouse when you get married, that it's important to continue to grow that relationship and foster it so the love gets deeper and stronger as the years go on. What is your definition of love? My definition of love is the same as Thomas Aquinas, which is love is to will the good of another. What I like about that definition is that covers everyone. So even someone I don't like, I can still love because I can will their good. Or like I can will the good of my parents. I have a different sort of love for my parents versus my spouse or children. So love, if you just use that definition, which is to will the good of another, that covers everything. Now, there's more to love than just that, but in a very strict sense of broadly what is love, I would say willing the good of another is a perfect definition in that it covers all forms of love for all people that you could ever run into. Can arranged marriages be as successful as traditional marriages? Arranged marriages were the common thing throughout all of society for most of society, so in some ways one could say that's traditional form of marriage, but here we're talking about what we think of as marriage. So people that decide themselves because they love each other to get married. Can arranged marriages be successful? Yes, they always were. In fact, I could make an argument they were more successful, or even still are more successful than traditional marriages. I think the key is that you have to work together for a common goal or goals and do that as a couple. Really, the most important thing for marriage, and Bishop Fulton Sheen wrote a book called Three to Get Married, which is the greatest book ever written on marriage. I would recommend anyone read that book. You can get it for free on EWTN website. But the main premise that he's talking about there is that God is that third person of a marriage. And so if both spouses love God even more than they love themselves or their spouse, then God keeps that marriage together. God is like the super glue of a marriage. So if you have God at the center and focal point of your marriage, regardless of if it's an arranged marriage or a traditional marriage, that marriage will be successful. What is the significance of both Isaac and Ishmael bearing Abraham? First off, it just shows that Isaac was being very generous to his brother. Ishmael was kicked out, and now he's back to bury his father. Isaac allowed that to happen. And I think it's something that is getting overlooked here. I think Isaac, in a lot of ways, gets the short end of the stick in the Bible because we kind of quickly move on from him to his children. But throughout the narratives that Isaac is in, he seems like a very generous, good, faithful person. And we're seeing it here. There's also another significance just in that death tends to draw people back together. So this kind of suffering of death, and we've talked about that previously in this Bible study, but it draws people together. Suffering can draw people together. So a lot of times when people say, oh, God's not fair to allow suffering in the world, but suffering can and usually does draw people closer together. And maybe that's something to keep in mind when you think about why God allows suffering. Is that the only reason? Probably not. And really, you'll have to ask him when hopefully you get to heaven and can ask him on why he allows suffering. But suffering definitely can draw people together, and we see that here in the death of Abraham. And that's it for the study guide answers to session 6 of this Genesis Bible study. And hopefully everyone is enjoying the video so far, and the questions are making them reflect and think some. And I look forward to the next video session. Bye.